Breaking news. Putin has threatened retaliation if Ukraine employs cluster munitions. Putin stated during an interview that Russia has a sufficient supply of a variety of cluster munitions. Russian President Vladimir Putin reportedly stated, days after Ukraine received cluster munitions made in the United States, that Moscow also possesses such weapons and would consider using them against Ukraine if they are used against us, as reported by CNN. During an interview, the Russian leader said, Russia has a sufficient supply of various types of cluster munitions. Putin was quoted by CNN as saying, if they are used against us, we reserve the right to mirror actions. Human rights organizations strongly opposed Washington's decision to ship cluster bombs to Kyiv. Because the weapons disperse explosive material, so-called bomblets, over wide areas, they pose a significant threat to civilians and non-combatants when used near populated areas. CNN reported that unexploded ordnance that does not detonate upon impact poses a long-term risk to anyone who comes into contact with it, much like landmines. Cluster bombs can detonate multiple bomblets simultaneously over an area as large as several football fields. They can be launched from the ground or the sea, or dropped from a plane. The mini-nuclear weapons are dropped from the sky. From tens to hundreds is a reasonable range to expect. However, as much as a third of them fail to detonate upon impact and thus continue to pose a deadly threat to civilians for years to come. It has been reported by CNN that nearly 40% of cluster bomb casualties are children. Because of the risks posed by cluster bombs, more than 100 countries, including the UK, France, and Germany, have signed a treaty banning their use. According to CNN, Vice President Joe Biden said it was a very difficult decision to send cluster munitions to Ukraine, but that he ultimately made the decision to do so because Kyiv needs more ammunition to continue fighting Russian troops off Ukrainian territory. After receiving assurances in writing from Kyiv that it would not use the cluster munitions in urban areas, a senior official at the U.S. Department of Defense stated as much. Putin went on to say that he agreed with the Biden administration's labeling of cluster munitions use as a war crime. Former White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said at the beginning of the conflict last year that reports of Russia's use of cluster bombs, if confirmed, would constitute a war crime, according to CNN. Putin did not directly address this statement. Putin also stated, contrary to evidence, that Russia has not used cluster munitions. At the beginning of March, the United Nations reported that it had collected credible reports of at least 24 separate incidents in which Russian forces had used cluster munitions in populated areas. CNN reported last year that the Kremlin fired 11 cluster rockets at Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine, in the early days of the conflict.